The black screen was never the twist. The twist is that surviving would be the worst possible ending, because death is clean. Prison is at least an ending. Survival is the real punishment. Waking up the next morning to a life that's already collapsing, with no dignified exit and no clean successor. Just the same machine, louder, hungrier, and suddenly convinced the boss is replaceable. That's the part people keep missing while they argue about the diner like it's a crime scene crossword puzzle. The question isn't, did he get shot? The question is, what's left if he doesn't? A crew that's thinning out, leadership options that range from unstable to embarrassing, and allies who don't do sympathy, especially for a man who's now more legal liability than legend. Add a federal case that doesn't care about feelings, a circle full of informants, and a family that treats loyalty like a contract with no expiration date. So yes, he might have walked out of that diner. And if he did, congratulations. He didn't escape the ending. He just earned the longer version. Now watch what happens when the fantasy of retirement meets the reality of what this world actually allows. Prison, death, or the slow, humiliating third option nobody wants to say out loud. The fantasy of a mob boss retiring after a near-death experience has the sweet, comforting logic of a corporate exit package. Health scare, heartfelt speech, orderly transition, a tasteful handshake, and a quiet life of reduced stress. Unfortunately, organized crime is not a publicly traded company, and its leadership succession is not handled by human resources. The entire premise collapses the moment the oath is taken seriously, which is, inconveniently, the only way the system functions at all. Retirement in that world is less a right than a rumor, granted sparingly to a microscopic fraction of men who survive long enough, earn enough, and, most importantly, remain useful enough to be tolerated while they step back. Even then, the word is doing heroic work. A former boss or revered elder may be permitted to live as though retired, but the obligation never expires. The call can still come, the favor can still be demanded, and the past can still be weaponized. It is not a pension plan. It is a lifelong lien. Against that backdrop, the notion that a sitting boss could announce that the job is stressful and simply bow out reads less like pragmatism and more like a misunderstanding of what keeps everyone compliant. The knowledge that the exit door is mostly decorative. The reasons are not subtle. First, there is the small problem of continuity. Who exactly is supposed to run things in the boss's absence? The sentimental idea of a dignified handoff runs headfirst into a roster that, at the relevant moment, resembles a waiting room of unsuitable candidates. An acting boss who cannot hold the chair for more than a blink. A would-be successor still paying reputational interest on years spent as an errand runner and caretaker. A protege so compromised, discredited, and self-destructive that the title would land on him like a joke with no punchline. A veteran who can talk for hours, yet struggles with operational basics when they stop being theoretical. Senior figures in and out of prison, peripheral voices with more chatter than credibility, and crew leaders who can barely manage their own corner without turning it into a fire hazard. The darkly comic implication is that the only clear option is the enthusiastic middle manager type, the so-called criminal mastermind, whose elevation would signal not renewal, but desperation. In other words, the boss does not retire because there is no clean successor. There is only the next crisis. Second, a boss stepping down is not perceived as humility or self-care. It is perceived as weakness. And weakness in that environment is not met with supportive wellness initiatives. It is met with someone else deciding the problem should be solved permanently before it becomes contagious. A retired boss who still expects tribute is dead weight with institutional memory. The kind of man who knows too much, can be pressured too easily, and can plausibly become a liability to everyone who once benefited from his discretion. If he stops expecting tribute, then the romance of retirement is replaced by arithmetic. The lifestyle that has been financed by envelopes and leverage does not gracefully downgrade to modest living. There is no tidy conversion from boss-level spending to civilian restraint. particularly for someone addicted to status, convenience, and the psychological narcotic of being catered to. Savings evaporate quickly when the household is built like a monument rather than a home. A mob boss without the job is either still taking a cut, thus inviting resentment and suspicion, or living off diminishing reserves, thus inviting contempt and opportunists. Either way, the retired boss is a problem whose solution becomes increasingly obvious. Third, the federal government has a long memory and the patience of a bureaucracy that enjoys being underestimated. When an indictment is looming, especially a racketeering case assembled over years, retirement does not erase exposure. It merely removes the protective friction of power. A boss in legal jeopardy is already living on borrowed time. A boss who voluntarily gives up the command structure that shields him is essentially offering the state a clearer shot. The bleak conclusion practically writes itself. The fate is not altered, only the timing and venue change. That is why the coldest, most accurate reading is that the end was baked in long before any dramatic hospital scene. By the time the story opens, the boss is already too deep. Compromised relationships, accumulating evidence, enemies with long memories, allies with shorter ones, and a personal identity fused to a role that cannot be resigned like a stressful job. There is, at best, a hypothetical alternate reality in which earlier circumstances, before a key leader's death, before internal rivalries hardened, while a senior figure served as a lightning rod, might have allowed a softer landing. Cooperation, exile, a reduced profile, a life of bland food and forced normalcy. But that is not a strategy. It is a daydream with better lighting. The supposed counterexample, older figures who retired, proves the rule. The men granted that privilege are either revered enough to be untouchable, compromised enough to be discarded, or useful enough to be kept around as symbolic furniture. Even they remain tethered. The call for one last job can still arrive, and refusal is not always a live option. The oath is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism. That same mechanism explains why a rank-and-file earner cannot simply announce a move to Florida and expect applause. Allowing a made man to walk away because he suddenly prefers sunshine would set a precedent that threatens the entire model. If one soldier can quit, others will start treating membership like a subscription service. The organization does not fear losing the sentimental bond. It fears losing the predictable flow of money and the coercive certainty that keeps men in line. One less envelope is not merely a financial inconvenience. It is a crack in discipline. The boss's refusal in that situation is often framed as jealousy or spite, misery demanding company. And there is truth in that. A leader who has built his world on control does not enjoy watching someone else buy freedom with a windfall. But even if personal resentment vanished, the structural logic remains. Exceptions become expectations, and expectations become instability. From the soldier's perspective, the tragedy is that the dream was sold as plausible. From the organization's perspective, the tragedy is that anyone believed it. The more damning critique falls on law enforcement handlers who dangle hope like bait and then yank it away with bureaucratic indifference, managing informants as disposable tools rather than human beings whose desperation can turn lethal. That is not moral outrage. It is operational incompetence, and it predictably ends in catastrophe. If the system must be summarized in one line, it is this. Once inside, the only approved exits are prison, death, or a rare, conditional illusion of retirement that is retirement in name only. If the question shifts from, could he retire, to, why was forgiveness offered in one attempted murder but not in another, the answer is not noble consistency. It is psychological triage wrapped in denial. An early assassination attempt can be reframed as business, politics, and manipulation, especially when it is emotionally convenient to locate the true villain elsewhere. Blame can be rerouted to a more comfortable target, allowing the would-be killer to be treated as a confused instrument rather than an autonomous threat. That reframing is not naivete. It is self-protection. Admitting that a beloved elder deliberately tried to end his life forces an unbearable revision of childhood loyalties and family mythology. So the story becomes, he was pressured, he was misled, he was used. Even direct insistence that the decision was his own can be waved away because the alternative is too corrosive. Years later, the second shooting lands differently because it cannot be neatly filed under misunderstanding or political necessity. It is physical, catastrophic, and humiliating. Worse, it arrives after time has passed in which the relationship was effectively placed out of sight, which allows the mind to fossilize the past into something less threatening. When the past returns with a gun, the denial collapses. Yes, the shooter is senile. Yes, intent is diminished. None of that magically edits the body's memory of trauma or the ego's memory of vulnerability. Forgiveness after a near miss is abstract. Forgiveness after a bullet is visceral. Add the bitter irony that dementia does not simply erase a person, it can strip away the flattering layers and expose the oldest habits: belittlement, needling cruelty, the casual ability to wound with a few words. So the victim experiences the attack as the culmination of a lifetime of being cut down. Whether the act was intentional becomes almost irrelevant. The emotional truth is that the harm is real, the relationship is unrecoverable, and the last remaining comfort, believing the elder always cared, is now suspect. The final encounter is therefore not catharsis, but a bleak elegy. The realization that the person once loved is not only incapable of accountability, but also effectively gone, leaving behind a shell that cannot offer closure. In a story obsessed with the corrosion of family bonds, that is the most punishing outcome. No retaliation to restore pride, no reconciliation to restore meaning, only the quiet knowledge that the one relationship that once felt uncomplicated has been ruined by time, violence, and illness. That emotional exhaustion also explains why panic looks different when prison appears at different points in the arc. Early on, the prospect of a clean, eyewitness-driven murder charge is terrifying because it feels immediate, binary, and uncontestable, a straightforward path to a cage with limited options for bail and little room for legal theater. The paranoia is acute because the threat is concrete. Later, when racketeering charges loom, built on cooperating witnesses, negotiated immunity, and sprawling narratives, the danger is enormous, but it is bureaucratic. It comes with delays, motions, plea negotiations, and the faint, expensive hope that a skilled attorney can muddy timelines and impeach credibility. In other words, it is not less lethal, it is less sudden. That procedural drag can paradoxically be calming, not because the defendant is safe, but because the mind can postpone terror into the future. More importantly, by the end, there is a different kind of fatigue, the spiritual exhaustion of someone who has been living under threat for years, who has already watched his circle shrink through death, betrayal, and self-inflicted damage, and who has started to accept that the story only ends one of two ways. The later indifference is not bravery, it is resignation. A man can only perform frantic denial for so long before the body chooses numbness as a survival tactic. When someone has been ground down by war, internal collapse, a child's crisis, and the loss of the one professional relationship that once offered a mirror, the legal apocalypse becomes just another item on a list of inevitable consequences. In that state, even a ketchup bottle tantrum reads like theater, a brief spasm of outrage before returning to the blankness of someone who has already internally conceded. There is also an unflattering but plausible subtext. Once the walls close in, the temptation to save oneself by cooperating becomes harder to dismiss. The mythology of unbreakable men collapses quickly under federal pressure. History is full of tougher figures who folded. A boss who has already flirted with friendly relationships across the line may not need much of a push when the alternative is dying in prison. That possibility does not redeem him. It simply completes the portrait. The debate about the finale, predictably, invites every kind of contortion. The black screen as death, the black screen as paranoia, the black screen as an audience trick, the black screen as metaphysics, the black screen as a smug refusal to answer. The most defensible pro-survival case is not there was no on-screen bullet, because storytelling is not a courtroom, and absence is not evidence. The strongest survival argument is procedural and political. A sit-down settlement was reached, brokered through a respected intermediary, and breaking that agreement immediately would violate protocol in a way that risks reputational consequences with other power centers. The war had produced its desired result, a rival removed, and the victor had little pragmatic incentive to reignite instability for sport. That is a coherent point. It is also not enough. Because the counterweight is the series' central insistence on inevitability, even if no one pulled the trigger in that diner, the life waiting outside is still a slow execution. A cooperating capo, years of evidence, legal fees capable of bleeding even a well-funded criminal enterprise, a weakened organization hollowed out by the loss of its best operators, and a family that remains functional mostly as performance art. Assume, generously, that the legal magician works wonders and the case weakens. Even then, the enterprise is diminished. Fewer high earners, more internal distrust, leadership appointments that feel like desperate reshuffling, and neighboring powers that see opportunity in the vacuum. Surviving the moment simply extends the sentence. It becomes an existence defined by looking over one's shoulder, interpreting every door opening as a possible assassination, and watching the empire decay into a glorified crew, held together by habit rather than strength. That, thematically, is the truest punishment. Not the mercy of a quick end, but the drawn-out consequence of a life chosen and never meaningfully revised. This is why the idea that survival is hopeful misses the point. Survival is the nightmare scenario. It is waking up the next day to an indictment, to a broken network, to a household still drenched in dysfunction, to the grim knowledge that even victory in court would still cost fortunes and dignity, and to the certainty that the next threat will arrive sooner or later. The occasional attempts to romanticize a post-series future, beating the case, going straight, reinventing oneself as a wholesome coach or civic figure, function as comedy precisely because they defy every established pattern of character and world. The narrative has been too clear. Therapy did not reform him. It refined his rationalizations. Stress did not humanize him. It sharpened his cruelty. Over time, he alienated, endangered, or destroyed those closest to him, sliding from baseline criminality into something colder and more self-justifying. Even the show's smaller jokes about missing takeout or being irritated by petty theft of personal comforts underscore the pettiness at the core. A man capable of immense violence still feels personally victimized when the universe denies him a trivial pleasure. That is the character, grandiosity stitched to grievance. The finale debate also collides with the question of scale. How big was this operation, really? The answer is that it is both powerful locally and comparatively minor next to the New York behemoths. New York has more bodies, more rackets, and a richer environment for theft, simply because the city provides more money to siphon. From that vantage, New Jersey is useful but not revered. A satellite that can be managed through intermediaries, occasionally mocked, and kept intact when convenient as a buffer against other encroachments. Paradoxically, that makes the local boss valuable as a stabilizing figure. Someone to keep order so that others do not have to invest resources in messy occupation. But it also makes his position precarious. He exists at the pleasure of larger forces, and when his crew weakens and the old model fades, even traditional shakedowns become harder to execute. The world changes, the margins tighten, the thing declines, and the men who built their identities on predation discover that modernity has fewer easy doors to kick in. In that landscape, retirement is not an option. Forgiveness is not clean. Prison is not always terrifying in the same way. And survival is not a victory. The only consistent through line is the same grim clarity the boss himself once admitted. The story ends in death or incarceration, and the only mystery is whether the curtain falls in a diner booth or under fluorescent courtroom lights. Subscribe for more essays that track characters long after the credits, into the slow collapse they earned.